So as Constance mentioned, I've been around since forever. And this is my second stint in Ohio. This is the only state I've lived in twice. And I was here at the beginning of Ohio Link, and I've returned now for the current iteration of Ohio Link. One of the points I'd like to make about this is my various history here. When I was at Nelanet, we implemented a commercial shared regional depository, and it was managed by an external company. The other thing I'd like to point out is that I've worked for many years with EIFL, which is a consortium, an international consortium in 50 developing countries. And be thankful that the problem that you have is too much stuff to manage, because when you don't have anything to manage in print, it makes life really easy, but it's not necessarily good. So, okay. So really when we start talking about this, what I'd like to point out is how much are we going to shave off of these collections? Which brings me to Occams Razor. So when you're making decisions about print management, William of Ockham said, for any given set of circumstances, the simplest explanation is best. Unfortunately for William, in complex situations, the simplest answer also often is wrong. So you may want to avoid that one. So I have a delicate question I need to ask when you start thinking about pruning your collection. Does your collection suffer from irregularity of use? If so, how do you know what or how much to keep? Perhaps I have something that can help. The ad goes into the child who has irregularity, and the mother says, I'll just give her some prunes. And the other mother says, oh, don't give her prunes, because you never know with prunes. Anybody remember the line? Are 3 too few? Are 6 too many? So, you know, when you're choosing how many copies to keep of something, you might want to think, are 3 too few? Are 6 too many? And so, you know, when we think about this, we want to think maybe we need Fletchers Consortium, because it's really better than prunes. So I saw this yesterday in the New York Times. And if we're really going to do some serious print management, isn't it time that we get this in gear? So multinational corporations, AT&T, Cisco, General Electric, IBM, and Intel, gotten together and they say that they're going to create the Internet of Things. And they say if we're going to do that, we really need interoperability, better building blocks, and better standards. And I'm thinking, if major Fortune 500 companies, Fortune 100 companies can get together on stuff like this, how come we can't figure out a common loan period? You know, if we're going to get stuck in decisions like this, then we're never going to actually provide the sort of services that we need to provide. And you may have seen this article in today's Wall Street Journal. How many people saw this article, Securing the Borders of Publishing? Okay, well, if you haven't, the American Association of Publishers and the Authors Guild have started talking about closing the door on libraries and amending the U.S. copyright law to require that royalties can be paid to publishers each time the work is borrowed or lent in physical form, which would certainly solve our print management problem, wouldn't it? Now, in case you're really worried, I made this up. Don't start tweeting it. But I do raise the point. What happens when suddenly something that we can't control changes our lives completely? Can we really think that we have any control over this? So what's the best approach that we want to take concerning print management? Now, at the start of your career, all you have is questions. Where I am, you hope that there's multiple choice questions, because you're going to have to pick one thing. And I'm going to give you some multiple choice questions in a little bit. But for a moment, think about the decisions you make and if the decision would have been the same if you had used the prevailing technology of the time. So if your only print that you're managing is cuneiform, do you think you'd have the same sort of depositories that we have today? If in the beginning of the 20th century and micrographics is coming out, and you get to the mid-century and Vannevar Bush is talking about Memex, which is all built around microforms, should we have built all of our future around nothing but microforms? Should we be building all of our future now around the expectation that ebooks are going to take off in exactly the trajectory that we think they're going to take off? Chip pointed out yesterday that in 1999, if we had all banked upon rocket books, we probably would be not sitting here today. So when we start looking at this, we have different service overlays that we need to be thinking about. We're looking about it in the local environment and the consortial environment. The first one is strategic. The second one is tactical. Third, we have to deal with financial issues. Once we've decided what we want to do and where we want to go with it, where's the money going to come from to make it happen? Then there are the political issues, which on campuses means faculty. And then we have the operational issues, finally, on the outer ring. If you don't solve the other problems, then you're not going to solve your operational problems. So what are some of the examples of this? So as I sat here yesterday, I thought, what is it that we're really trying to accomplish here? Are we trying to increase access to content? Are we trying to integrate electronic and print collection strategies and have a single strategy? Are we trying to reduce the amount of space required for storage? Are we trying to generate operational cost savings? Are we trying to ensure long-term preservation of the content? Now, what I'm going to ask you to do by a show of hands, you only get to choose one. All of the above is not an answer to this question. If you had to pick one, how many people would pick increased access to content? Not too bad. Some of you are reluctant. The hands are going up slowly. Integrating electronic and print collection strategies. A little bit of that. Reducing the footprint required for storage. A lot of that. Generating operational cost savings. Only one person's willing to admit that he wants to generate cost savings. Ensuring long-term preservation of the content. Also not too popular. Well, the point is, these are not all the same, and we sometimes have conflicting goals, and we need to remember that. We've got campus versus partnership. What's the best decision for my university versus what's the best decision consortially? And I mentioned to another consortium director yesterday, I had been a library director, I was a consortium director for a decade, I went back to the university, and yes, all the things that I bemoaned as a consortium director, I'm now saying, well, but I have to do this for my campus. So life changes your perspective when you have different jobs. So what is the consortium request doing? Why are they doing it? What am I gaining? What's the consortium gaining? And then we have other financial and political and operational decisions that we have to make in terms of the processes, the costs, whether or not we really think that this is going to be successful, reducing our out-of-pocket expenses, or whether it's a new add-on cost, for example. Now, we've had a lot of impact factors. The ARL index no longer counts volumes directly, which is nice because how many libraries just added stuff so that they could get into ARL or stay in ARL. There's an availability of stable and trusted in-state lending and borrowing systems in many states. We certainly have that in Ohio. There's the availability of trusted archives, things like JSTOR, so we can make decisions around something that we think is we can reasonably predict will still be there, assuming we can reasonably predict that we can afford it. And ebooks are maturing and may potentially replace print in the future, as Roger talked about, or they may coexist for some time to come. So when we think about it in terms of storage facilities, for example, what's the ROI for a storage facility? Do we really know? What's the basis of our making decisions about whether these things are good, bad, indifferent? We're throwing stuff in there. We're also assuring ourselves that we need to keep this stuff. But should we take it all off? Should we throw it all away? And if we can show the ROI, what's it going to be? What does success look like? And I think that that's really the outcome discussion that we need to be having. The storage conditions, one of the things, all of these storage facilities, such as in, we call them repositories and depositories, but let's face it, they're storage. We built all of these things in this state and in many other states, and we said, oh, Harvard said that it has to be a certain level of humidity and temperature control. It's really expensive to maintain those facilities. One of the things that we talked about extensively when we did this in New England, and we're now having the same discussions in the University Circle of Cleveland, because we're working with another commercial developer right now, is how much is good enough? Because really 68 to 72 degrees is what most of you hope for in your libraries. And frankly, when I worked in New England, I had many libraries that said, I'd just be happy with air conditioning. So, because you don't need air conditioning in New England. So what's the tipping point? What can we live with? What are we storing that's really so valuable? Do we really truly think that we're storing this for all time? Do we think that this is for eons? I don't think so. If we're going to pursue commercial options, what are the guarantees that we need to have there in terms of time and cost and space? So then ebooks, back files are coming into ebooks more and more. And Harvard, for example, announced the rock bottom rate of about $100,000 to buy all the Harvard University Press back files. Well, you could say that's a lot of money. You can also say, yeah, but it's all of the Harvard University Press stuff. And then you look at what do you have in print of all the stuff that Harvard University Press gave you, and how much of it duplicates the stuff that you have in print, and how much of the stuff that it duplicates in print has actually been circulating, and how much don't we have that we're going to gain by buying it electronically, and how many more people can use it if it's available electronically that probably weren't going to use it in print. These are the sorts of questions that we tend not to ask ourselves, and we tend, unfortunately, not to have a methodology for going through those questions. That's the important part. So coming back to are 3 copies too few or 6 too many, how many copies do we really need? And who owns the copies once they're retained? We put these things into collaborative storage facilities. And in Ohio, for example, when we would put these things in, it's, well, everybody can borrow it because they're just other facilities to lend from. But what happens if somebody says they want to leave the facility? Are they going to take their stuff out? Are they going to leave their stuff in? Whatever went in stays in? You know, those are the sorts of issues. We assume that once you're in a partnership, you're going to stay in a partnership. But I won't mention any particular organization, but some organizations are built largely around their sports conferences. And sports conference memberships seem to be fungible. So what happens if somebody is a member today and not a member tomorrow? Or a member now and not 25 years from now? And by the way, when we talk about how many copies are enough nationally, let me disabuse you of that notion. This ain't never going to have a national solution in the United States. And anybody who remembers the National Periodical Center knows why. Because we can't get our act together in this country, and it's just never going to happen on a national basis. We get it done on a statewide basis, that's as close as it's going to get. So we've been looking at a lot of statistics over the last day or so. And I want to remind everybody that statistics inform our decisions. They don't make them. So what do we learn? For example, one of these studies that was done recently was looking at all of the OhioLink institutions, much like the CIC study. And so I looked at all the items and I compared them to all the items compared to the circulation rate. How many items do we have? How often do they circulate? How many circulating items do we have, and what's the circulating rate? And what's the circulation to the circulation rate? Those were the 3 categories that we were given. And I did a correlation analysis. Anybody who knows anything about correlation analysis knows that there's very low correlations here, exceedingly low correlation rates. So when I look at this, I say, how much time this stuff has been circulating does not necessarily predict whether I should keep it, nor does it predict how much it's going to actually circulate in the future. And just for grins, I compared Case Western's statistics to University of Cincinnati. I picked Cincinnati because they have a programmatic mix that's very close to Case Western's, but on a public basis. And you know, their correlation is just as low. Actually, it's a little bit lower, but I just think that we need to really know how to interpret statistics. Here's another statistic I looked at. So is it really surprising to find out that the more stuff you have and the more recently it's been published, the more it's going to circulate? Do we need more studies on this? Probably not, but here's the data to show it in case you've been wondering. So how closely do we shape print management? Well, in the spirit of Occam's Razor, I remind you of what Justice Louis Brandeis said at the Supreme Court. In most matters, it's more important that the applicable rule of law be settled than that it be settled right. And this is commonly true even when the error is a matter of serious concern. I'm going to leave you with a few things to ponder about print management. First, don't overcomplicate it and don't oversimplify it, because know that those who learn from the past will be condemned to make different mistakes than those who came before us, and that past practice never predicts future behavior. Second, statistics guide us, but they never lead us. Third, best practices won't be best for very long. They are transient in nature. You can assess and manage risk, but you can't eliminate it. But don't worry, this is print management we're talking about, not brain surgery. If we make a really bad mistake, it won't be the worst thing in the world. Regardless of what you decide, time will prove some of your decisions to be wrong. So forgive those who made bad decisions before you and hope that future generations will forgive you. And most importantly, do something, do anything, because it's always better to do something than to talk and never get anything done. So with that, I leave you with this thought. For centuries, we've all been buying crap. And we don't think it's crap, we think it's intellectual. And it is intellectual, and it is important, and I don't mean to diminish the importance. But I do point out, again, I return to my point about Eiffel. When you don't have crap to manage, it makes your life simpler. And when electronic information came out, they suddenly had all the same information that we all have in this country. And so really think about, do you need this stuff before you just keep it? Thank you.
Okay, well, I wish I had videos as entertaining as Arnold's, I must say. It just really makes for a great start. I do have some images. I'll get to them. I do apologize. My first few slides are fairly text intensive, but we were asked to reflect on operations and services for monographs in particular. I was asked to reflect on what it means to manage multiple large-scale shared print initiatives, the challenges around collaboration and governance, challenges that the libraries participating in these efforts face, particularly when working on the same material that is contributed to multiple archives. I'll dedicate a couple of slides to that and a bit of conversation around that. To the extent that the initiatives I'll be mentioning are largely focused on or primarily focused on journals, I will then move quickly off of that into monographs. I was asked to be provocative around some suggestions around monographs, and we'll do that. So looking at this question of scope and scale and stewardship, there are two shared print initiatives I can comment on. The UC Shared Print Initiative, which began in 2004 and continues today. Part of its evolution and into the Western Regional Storage Trust, which is a network-level storage trust. Is my microphone still on? Okay, it sounded a little waffly here. So the UC Shared Print Initiative started in 2004. There are 10 institutions of the University of California in it, 2 storage facilities, the Northern and Southern Regional Library facilities. Thus far, we have collectively retained and have under retention commitment more than 250,000 volumes. They are held both in storage and in place at some of our libraries. The focus is on multiple publication types, including journal back files, monographs, even microform sets, and art slides, all kinds of physical publication types. The projects include both prospective and retrospective projects, so collaborative collection development and collaborative collection management efforts. And we have seen, and this is also something we're seeing playing out in the Western Regional Storage Trust, some unusual suspects that emerge as archive holders. And I think this is a common theme that we've heard yesterday, particularly in the Michigan case and others, institutions that perhaps disproportionately serve as archive holders in a partnership than relative to their physical holdings or their role in their particular consortium. So we've seen this we have substantial shared print collections held at UC Merced, which ostensibly is a primarily digital library. UC San Diego, UC Irvine, and UC Riverside. That's not to say that some of our other very large institutions are not holding substantial shared print archives as well, but proportionally to their role in the consortium, these are outliers and quite interesting. The Western Regional Storage Trust began in 2009, continues today, it's very much at the supra-consortial level, so it has moved beyond the consortia that is the California Digital Library. It has moved beyond the consortia and includes consortia, including the Orbis-Cascade Alliance, the SCELC libraries of independent and private universities in California and actually beyond California. Also, again, looking at scale, more than 250,000 volumes retained, fewer years to accomplish that, so we are seeing an acceleration in shared print retention commitments. The materials are held in place and in storage. There are 6 facilities. This is a multi-state cooperative. The focus is entirely on journal back files, retrospective holdings. And again, we are also seeing some unusual suspects, including Loyola Marymount University, and we anticipate in the next year a far broader distribution of archive holding commitments. We currently have about 20 archive holders in the region. We will probably add about 30 additional archive holders this next year to accomplish one of our major goals, which is to archive all of the journal titles in Portico and clocks in the next year. So some additional aspects to comment on. I would say both of these shared print activities are moving into or have reached maturity. We are moving out of implementation phases and into that sustainability and mature phase. Both initiatives are either undergoing or have completed a strategic planning process, have undergone assessments either at a project or programmatic level. Both include governance committees at a variety of levels, director and operational level. At the UC Shared Print Initiative, we will be moving ahead in a monographs program in the next several years. Integration and infrastructure are key themes that we're seeing at both levels. Integration in the UC Shared Print program around broader collaboration within the state and really thinking about the role that either our archives play or that our institutions may play in regional or network level collaboratives. The UCs, of course, are founding and initial partners in HathiTrust and are very committed to the advancement of the HathiTrust shared print archive for monographs. Similarly, in the Western Regional Storage Trust, the governance committee here I should comment on is a governance committee that is there are 2 committees that are representative and bring representatives from multiple consortia. So when we were talking earlier yesterday about what is the right size for collaboration, this particular partnership is very much a collaboration that has moved we've talked about management at the institutional level, moving to the consortial level, we are now at a place where we are managing print collections at the consortial level. So we have moved beyond even our traditional consortia that manage research sharing partnerships and electronic licensing and whatnot. It creates its own set of interesting challenges about the relationship between consortia and shared print networks. So I will move quickly now into shared monographs, and kind of keying off of and leading up, continuing that theme about what is the right scale of governance, what is the right scale of decision making. For monographs, we may want to seriously consider whether we move quickly, if not immediately, to the network level. I'm not advocating necessarily a national solution, but some form of a super consortial level of collaboration. We have heard from Roger's presentation and others, we simply cannot avoid the access and user expectation component around monographs. We will be in a dual format environment for many years to come. Some of the key challenges I think we will need to do is work on finding mechanisms to shift resource to support the transformation of collections to benefit multiple institutions. We will likely need to work on building an ecology of partnerships, or probably a network level partnership, to provide access to formats that are needed for research across both archive holding and non-archive holding institutions. It will be extraordinarily important, I think, for us to move forward from the outset with institutions that fill both of these kinds of roles. It's very likely we need to really think about the service environment, if not start at the service environment, reinventing delivery of digital and print books, perhaps initially from our shared repositories, both digital and print repositories, and seriously consider leveraging our users' behaviors, our increased demand for print from a extraordinarily reinvented delivery service to generate and shift those resources amongst institutions. So I have spoken and written about this quite a bit, and it has been mentioned both in Roger's keynote and other venues about, what is it about monographs? I frequently get asked the question, well, can't we leverage what we've done for journals and just advance monographs through that? There are some important infrastructure components that we have developed for journal retention commitments. Most notably, I would say the OCLC metadata standards for recording retention commitments, an extraordinarily important piece, building block to collaboration. But there are some really fundamental differences around journals and monographs that suggest we need a different model. We need a different approach to our shared print strategies. I won't belabor this too much. We have talked about that the book is or the volume is the desired unit of access. Print and electronic are used differently. We are starting some research. I would encourage the community to do a lot more research on the ethnographic component that Roger suggested, but also around really understanding when and at what points in the research life cycle users use different work sets of print and digital monographs, and what implications does that have for the ways that we manage these two formats from collections of fewer copies. There's a variety of other differences here, but suffice to say, I think we can safely say that copyright law and the advancement of sustainable business models around the delivery of the full text that we have digitized will not be resolved for another generation or two. So I expect this will be my son's generation that needs to deal with this topic of how we can deliver the full text. And as we all know, space is a major driver, and deselection is much more complicated with for monographs. So I would like us to start to think about starting the conversation from the user's perspective, assuming we're going to be in a dual format environment. I was asked to ask some very provocative questions. My first is, if we are converting our libraries to places, why do we expect them to come in to pick up their books? There is a huge opportunity cost. I think we need to understand more what that opportunity cost is to our students and our faculty to come into the library to pick up their books as a result of the various transitions through the interlibrary lending, the current interlibrary lending process. We are seeing more research and studies that saying our users are satisficing, they're using or citing things that are easier to get at because it is difficult for them to access materials. We are also seeing these statistics, I think we're all recording them, of declining use. And I would like to posit that perhaps it is because our logistics model is not responsive to the way 21st century users expect to receive physical materials in the future and currently. Would it be possible for us to implement popular delivery services from print and digital repositories to better support research and perhaps arrest these trends in satisficing that we're seeing? We need to understand more about what the unmet demand is and what the potential use is for our print and digital collections. I don't think it's enough for us to do these elaborate usage studies if we're basing them on an existing logistics model that is out of tune with the way our users interact with physical goods today. So another question that one of our senior administrators has asked me is, should we invest more in advancing digitization and digitizing, or in optimizing print delivery? And one of the things I've been pondering is, are those mutually exclusive? Could we consider or think about digitized print? That is, the content that we have, the retrospective collections that we've all digitized either through Internet Archive, mass digitization with HOT, individual libraries engaging in digitization. Can we, by definition, that material is now, because we have a digital copy of it, regardless of your perspective on the quality of that content and digital scan, by definition, the print for those resources is at lower risk than the vast majority of our collections that have not yet been digitized. So would it be possible for us to think about putting that digitized print to work to digitize the remaining general collections that we have not yet attended to? I wanted to step back and look at some of the emerging models for shared print monographs. We've heard reports on those yesterday, and some additional ones that we've heard at ALA, at various shared print symposia. There are some very notable projects underway, of course, at Michigan and Maine. Those projects, I would suggest, in particular, the advancement of the Northeast partnership that's underway, that are expanding our notions of trust and the notions of boundaries of trust. We are seeing many more retention commitments made in place rather than we would normally or sometimes think of a shared repository as the material that's in a storage facility. So I think this notion of the collective collection will have multiple location types. We are seeing the broad distribution of commitments among partners. That seems to be a real common theme. And we are seeing sharing go beyond the bounds, or these retention commitments going beyond the bound of resource sharing networks. And it's starting to raise that question of, do we need to start negotiating more and more elaborate resource sharing networks? Is that sustainable? Many of the institutions are leveraging the OCLC's shared print infrastructure. Most notably, Maine has now registered 500,000. I'd like to applaud that. That's an incredible advancement around monograph sharing. Yeah. One of the things we talked about, we were questioning this aspect of sustainability. Several of these partnerships have embarked on fairly elaborate collection analyses, but I feel like there's this sort of common theme that happens with them. 2 to 10 million holdings are analyzed, 500,000 are identified that are at some level beyond 3 copies of duplication, and that should we embark on a retention commitment to those would yield multiple copies for deselection. So I wonder if it would be possible for us, looking at those various projects, to now generalize and extrapolate a set of simpler selection criteria that could be engaged at the network level. So those have been very important learning efforts, and I wonder if we could work from those to really think now about whether continuing to do those consortial level collection analyses is sustainable and the costs associated with those, or whether we can now generalize from those and start to think about some very simple collection criteria, at least to start and to launch a network level partnership. If we think about this notion that we will have and are seeing distributed archive holders for monographs, would it be possible for us to have simply 2 categories of material that we focus on? The digitized print, essentially, so the material that's been digitized and is in either HathiTrust or Portico. We can debate about which the digital repositories we focus on, and the undigitized, so the washed and the unwashed. And I also, looking at the Ohio Link study, I think it would be really interesting to focus on the titles that have had any prior use. So the Ohio Link study really, the thing that resonated for me there was that any aspect of prior use was a predictor of future use. And perhaps where we want to be focusing on are the titles that have potential future use. So that's a suggestion that maybe we can simplify the entire collection analysis and selection process and really focus on and move forward on the service infrastructure. One of the key things that we've seen that's been very successful in the Western Regional Storage Trust in advancing print collaboration is guaranteeing the pace of archiving across the institutions. Every institution has its pressures, its needs, its ability to move forward, but when you're working at a consortial or a super consortial level, finding mechanisms to guarantee that pace of archiving is extraordinarily important. We have these annual archiving cycles in the Western Regional Storage Trust. I wonder for monographs whether we couldn't establish some kind of basic quota amongst our various consortia that are really thinking hard about this topic, to say, what if we just looked at 500,000 works per year per consortium or repository in each of those 2 categories that I mentioned. So I think what I'm trying to get at here is, if we want to think about sustainability, we need to move quickly in the first few years to retention commitments and away from the selection and collection analysis piece. That's not to say we don't need to do that. We will need to do that over time, but it may be that we need to amass that corpus of retention commitments so that we can leverage then at the network level, at a much cheaper network level, the kinds of analyses that OCLC research does for us, where we can shine a bright light on the materials that we have retained and figure out where we need to go next, where we have not yet made retention commitments. Another question that's been asked, I'm forgetting who asked me this question, is this just a resource sharing problem? Should we just negotiate more elaborate resource sharing agreements? And my argument or my suggestion is that it's not. It's not just, resource sharing is a substantial piece of the pie. But I think more importantly, we need to think of the broader environment in which our libraries are operating right now. We have seen university investment in era libraries decline substantially over the last several decades. The monograph collections have borne the brunt of those declines as we invest more in journal collections. The other area, of course, is our staff, which is we've seen some alarming declines in our staffing levels there. So I think it was yesterday evening on the Colbert Report, if any of you were staying up really late, the president of Harvard was talking about the extraordinary revolution in higher education that will occur in the next 5 to 10 years. So I think in that context, this is not just a resource sharing problem. It's an extraordinary issue around resource allocation and appropriateness of our resource allocations. It is also a resource distribution problem. The resources that we hold in our aggregate storage facilities, we know from the OCLC research cloud sourcing report, could substantially replace the supply across the network. Involving some additional libraries in that through some kind of distributed retention commitments would substantially replace the supply of many institutions. So it's an asset. A key aspect is resource distribution. We have a real inequity in the places where we need resources to be distributed to advance some of our goals here. I think we need to take some cues from both the music and video rental industries to understand that the long-tail demand may substantially increase for physical resources if we implement fully unmediated direct delivery. So I know that sounds very controversial, and that was what I was asked to do, but we are currently in an environment in resource sharing where our interlibrary lending practices are to move things from one warehouse to another warehouse to another warehouse, and then we ask the user to come into a warehouse. Many industries will say that is an extraordinarily inefficient process, and may be what is causing some of this satisficing behavior that we're seeing nowadays. If we are interested in continuing to advance that sort of democratic access to our collections and continuing to advance the quality of research that we see amongst our future generations, we may need to think about, seriously rethink our resource sharing approaches. And finally, I would say the problem we are facing is also a political one. I think many have mentioned that, but I can say that collaboration around monographs are at the core of our culture. They're at the core of library culture, but they're also at the core of civic culture. This is more than a 500-year topic. We don't have the answers for it and won't have the answers for it, but at the end of the day, there are political decisions. Many of the decisions that we will need to make around shared print monographs will be political. They will not necessarily be guided by statistics and evidence. So some more provocative questions. I haven't been monitoring my time here, but First question I have, it has to do with business modeling and logistics. I think we need to do some serious and large-scale experiments here. Would our scholars use print and digital book collections substantially more if we visually co-located print and digital copies and provided direct delivery services to their devices or homes, something akin to Netflix? And can we engage users in non-archive holding libraries to support retention and digital conversion by providing very popular delivery services? Something to think about. Another suggestion that I have proposed is perhaps we should start to think about developing a cloud service layer. Perhaps Hati and WorldCat could be the backbone of it, perhaps. That would be supported by libraries and users, supplied by our digital and print repositories, and powered by enhanced access services like digitization, scan on demand, direct delivery by mail, maybe even some of the suggestions we heard from Gwen. So I think, suffice to say, the theme is I think we need to move very quickly beyond the selection and collection analysis, get retention commitments made, and use those as the backbone for enabling some of these network level services that will continue to advance and provide the incentives for multiple institutions to participate in network level collaboration. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Kathy Fountain. I'm from the Orbis-Cascade Alliance. And I want to kick off my talk with another sort of funny quote that I discovered while I was doing some background reading for this. And I think it sort of sums up why we're here. And it sums up, I think, why Orbis-Cascade Alliance is so invested in collaborative collections. So Milton Wolfe and Marjorie Bloss in 1988, so the year before 1999, when people started talking about share print, had an article about collections, modern collections, and they said the traditional research library goal of building and maintaining large, self-sufficient collections is not only anachronistic, it's also economically moronic. So I think that with that in mind, you know, the Orbis-Cascade Alliance came together by bringing together some libraries from Oregon and some libraries from Washington into a consortium together. And when that happened, the libraries you see listed here, the types of libraries, 37 academic libraries, some have joined very recently, but it's a really eclectic mix of types of libraries. We've got community colleges, private colleges that are traditional small liberal arts colleges, a number of four-year colleges, including some very research-intensive institutions and others that are more comprehensive. And we have one fully dedicated health sciences library, and we have a large FTE. And really, the heart of our consortium is in sharing. Let me see, will it come up? There we go. And I don't know, that's probably all very small, and I'm not going to read all of it to you, but what I wanted to do is sort of talk a little bit about sharing as a philosophy in the Orbis-Cascade Alliance, and that really, when we talk about what we're doing with monographs or what we're doing with journals, it really comes down to this idea that we share collectively. And we share, and you can see three statements here. One's from 2007 after the modern iteration of the Orbis-Cascade Alliance was formed, a vision statement about collections in our consortium as being one collection that we shared. That's been modified to the present, but it really focuses, and I'm going to bring your attention to the last statement, which is from our new strategic agenda, where we design for engagement, we collect wisely, we share freely, and we enhance the teaching, learning, and research environment. And I think that gets at the heart of what a lot of our conversations are about in terms of collections. Ownership is important in the Orbis-Cascade Alliance, but sharing is actually a little more important. And in fact, going back to what Gwen said about OhioLink, the summit system in the Orbis-Cascade Alliance was developed after the OhioLink coordinated catalog was developed. And our coordinated catalog, where our users can search for the holdings in all of our Orbis-Cascade Alliance libraries, is called Summit, and our brand is Summit. So when I took this position 7 months ago, people knew where I was going because they knew that the consortium ran Summit. They knew very little else about the consortium, but they knew that the consortium ran Summit and that Summit was really the backbone for research in the Orbis-Cascade Alliance. So that even institutions like the one I came from, where I was at a small regional campus of a large research institution, had resources beyond the 30,000 physical items that were located within our building. And so this, I think, what I'd like to talk about is that Summit really drives a number of our initiatives, and the fact that we have Summit allows us to cooperate not only in loaning but in holding and in purchasing. Because if we can share it, then we can think of our collection as one shared collection. And so I want to sort of talk a little bit about loaning, holding, and purchasing. And really, Summit's been around for 20 years, almost as long as InReach for Ohio Link has been, and it's really the heart of our consortium. We have unmediated borrowing. The requests come in. We started off with InReach. We moved to OCLC's Navigator system, and we're moving to an Alma peer-to-peer direct borrowing system within our new shared ILS. And really, in all those instances, the attempt is to unmediate as much as possible, to automate the borrowing, to treat a borrow like a circulation rather than like an interlibrary loan. So we try to, which creates efficiencies. It reduces the need for staff, but it also increases the delivery time. And I think that those are critical elements, that without those things and without an underlying delivery mechanism, which is nowhere near as sophisticated as what Emily is proposing, it is a van that drives from place to place with books and drops them off. But, you know, at least that it is there, and it can enormously expand the collections of very small libraries. And large libraries use it as well. As we have seen again and again and again in these presentations, borrowing is critical. In terms of purchasing for the Orbis-Cascade Alliance, we do coordinate our purchasing to a certain degree. We have a threshold policy where when we look, and this has been around for just a few years, I think 5 at most, where when we look at the collection as a whole, and we ask selectors when they make purchasing decisions to really look at the collection as a whole, to make choices about what they're going to buy based on what they see is in the consortium as a whole. Now, they make those decisions seeing what's available, but also considering their local needs. So the threshold really is voluntary. But what we're asking is that we keep to 3 copies whenever possible. So if there are 3 existing copies in the Orbis-Cascade Alliance, then maybe you don't need another copy. Maybe you could buy something else that's on a similar topic that is not yet held widely across the Alliance, and that we can capture more of that long tail that would then be present within the consortium and then could be shared across all of our libraries. And that we would then speed up delivery for those materials that we might have otherwise not purchased by delivering them through the Summit system and not having to go outside through an ILL system. Now that 3-copy threshold is implemented in widely various ways. Many people say they have an informal 5-copy threshold internally. You know, that they recognize that the consortial level is 3, but really they just do 5, so because they think they need a lot more locally. So we have some issues of implementation, but it is voluntary, so those issues are not terrible. We also have, based on sharing and the philosophy of sharing in terms of shared purchasing, have moved to an ebook model, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with in the Orbis-Cascade Alliance. We consortially belong to a DDA program with EBL that is a joint ownership program. So it's run by the Alliance. And we do short-term loans for the whole of the Alliance. We purchase books for the whole of the Alliance with a multiplier. And so that when those books are purchased are then owned, they're shared ownership across our institutions, and all institutions have access to it. So that's how we've addressed the issue of ebooks, although not in enough quantity that makes us really happy. So it's really scratching the surface and costs a lot of money, but it's at least a step in the right direction, I think. We've also addressed shared collections with weeding. We did a distributed print repository pilot from 2005 to 2008. It was an attempt to try to begin archiving journals. We started with the American Chemical Society journals and the JSTOR Arts and Sciences 1 and 2. that effort eventually was folded into the West project, which came along in 2009, I believe. And so when we wrapped up our MOUs, we then joined West as a consortium to continue to support distributed print repository more broadly. And for us, at this moment, the distributed print repository for the Alliance really is synonymous with West. We haven't done much in the way of monographic distribution and holding commitments, but I think that's coming. What we have done instead is looked at a last copy policy where institutions are asked to, as they are doing their weeding, when they come across a title that is the last copy in the consortium, to notify their consortium partners that they would like to withdraw that title, and then other partners are able to accept that title as part of their own collection if they would like to keep that title. So really sort of a stopgap effort, and we've got a little bit of work to do there, which I'll talk about later. What's been pretty elusive to us as a consortium is storage. I was really pleased to see the large-scale storage facility yesterday morning, because I had heard about the Harvard model that our consortium had worked very hard to try to find funding for. They'd garnered the support. They developed a business model for funding it within the consortium, and then simply didn't get the funding from the state in order to build the facility. And the need for storage has not gone away. It's simply been addressed in institutions as needed by weeding extensively. And one of the real challenges with that is that as libraries are renovating and as libraries are needing to recapture space, we don't have at this point a consortial approach to helping them make weeding decisions or helping them make retention decisions even within the context of the whole. And what that allows for really is those that go first get the most benefit because they can weed, ruthlessly, and that those who come later really have some substantial challenges. So I think before we expand a distributed print repository program to monographs, we really are going to need to look at the storage issue again and think about it pretty hard. Let's see. And what comes next for us? So in terms of collaboration around collections, and really collaborations around a number of things. Our shared ILS efforts, which I'm sure also many of you in this room are familiar with, this is a way to pull all that stuff together. I was asked last night if this is a throwback to Ohio Link's efforts to pull everyone together with an ILS. I really can't address that. All I know is we're doing it, and we're doing it for some good reasons. But one of the things we thought is that a shared ILS, a next generation ILS, helps us with a number of different goals around collaborations. One of them is in sharing technical work and sharing them in a distributed model. So not just sharing the end product resources that we're managing, but actually sharing staff across institutions to manage those resources. So products that many of us license, maybe we would have somebody who manages the license details and manages the activation, and we have other libraries that manage different products and manage the records for those products for all of us. And we are actually moving that way in terms of our DDA program, where we're going to manage our records by a single person in the system to provide access to all of us. So this is really, I would say, an effort that is not separate from shared print. It's not separate from shared collections. It's really part and parcel of that. The other thing that we're really hoping to do, which completely goes against what Emily was proposing, is doing some use analysis and some holdings analysis before we go down the road of doing too much in terms of storage and distributed print repository. But there are consequences to moving to a shared ILS as well, which loom large in my mind, is that we're giving up the data we've had in our legacy systems, that some of it is coming over, but it's not coming over in the way that we knew it in the old system, and we don't yet know how we'll be able to analyze it in the new system, and that gives me deep, grave concern. But the good thing is that I think the new system we're moving to has really robust analytics, and in the long term is going to serve us very, very well with a number of these. And what I'm hoping we'll see is that we won't have to do projects where we might draw down titles every 10 years. Maybe we're doing it as needed. Maybe we're able to generate a use analysis on the fly because the metrics are so good and that they're built into it at a consortial level that we'll be able to see local collections within the consortial context at the drop of a hat, not in terms of who owns it, but as in what's the use at these institutions? Is mine getting used? Is another getting used more? Should I let mine go because this other one is in a better place for circulation? That's the kind of thing I'm hoping that we'll see and that we'll capture in the long term with this new system. Let's see. How am I on time? Actually, I'm going fast. Make up for time. So the other thing I want to talk about, at least in terms of what comes next, not just what the shared ILS project and what we're doing right now, but really thinking about shared collections. We're waiting a little bit on the shared ILS. The shared ILS initiative is taking considerable staff time. I was reminded of this during our conversations yesterday, where a shared print effort takes a lot of staff time. Implementing a shared ILS takes a lot of staff time. And sometimes when you're doing something like that, you aren't left with a lot of time and effort to put into another large effort. So we're waiting. I think there are some short-term easy fixes we can do once our shared ILS is up and running. One of them is we really want to look at the threshold policy. Right now it's completely acquisitions history-based, which means if the system as a whole, the most common number of copies was 4. So what we thought is we'd implement a 3-copy policy so that we would at least reduce duplication, maybe try to get the most frequently duplicated purchase copy at 3, and that's freeing up some money for some institutions to buy some extra things that maybe weren't as duplicated. But maybe what we need to do is look at circulation and how frequently a title is circulated, and maybe think about are there trends we can look at in terms of use and make some decisions about a threshold based on use that maybe are a little more sophisticated. In certain subjects, maybe Pacific Northwest history subjects, we want to focus on 5 copies because these are going to be heavily used. Many will be checked out on a regular basis. We want something to be available to our users. Maybe that kind of thing. Maybe there are pockets of research that are done in the Northwest that need to be represented because they are studied by a number of people and they're not Pacific Northwest topics. I think some of the analysis that Constance and Brian did could help us make some of those decisions. And also our last copy policy. We have real staff inefficiencies with our last copy policy. Our last copy policy is simply, if it is the last copy in the system, you offer it up. But the last copy could be a very old edition no one wants to look at. It could be an outdated medical guide. It could be a textbook. I think we have some work to do around guidelines about what needs to be offered and what do we value as a consortium and what do we want to see on those lists so that staff don't have to be filling out all of these offers, spending all of that time when really they send them out and they often don't get any response. And it's because they're these not very valuable materials to the consortia. So I think in the short term, we've got a little bit of work, but we also need to think long term about where our efforts are in terms of deduplication, in terms of digitization. HathiTrust at the moment is very popular with our directors and deans, but less popular with the staff because of the amount of work, and the payoff is the dark archive. There's not a lot that's visible. So we want to think very strategically about how we engage with that effort. And a lot of our libraries are just very small. So if we've got a small staff, it's very different than being a research one and being like a number of you in the room here have substantial resources, substantial collections where you're capturing a lot of space by these efforts, and some of us are just not doing the same. So I think we need to think about that. And then I mentioned storage earlier. Probably reignite that issue. There may be some movement. We have some members who just desperately need storage. So we're watching those pretty closely and hoping that the Alliance can capitalize on whatever is done at a local level and think really hard about how we do storage. And talking, I think it was actually Gwen and Amy when I met you in January about, how do you approach this? And so in my mind is something that the two of you said is that we want to maybe do deduplication first and then move into storage. And that way we can minimize the amount of storage we need and maximize the return we get on it for the cost of building that storage. But at the same time, there are going to be upfront costs in terms of staffing. So sort of thinking about that trade-off is weighing heavy on my mind. And with that, I'm going to close. So thank you very much for your time.
Really, libraries do not exist for their own sake. They are libraries so that they can provide their constituent populations with a set of services. And these constituent populations are not afraid to be vocal if we are not meeting their needs. Now, in many respects, the collections that we are collectively or individually managing are the largest service that we offer to many of those populations. And their physical management is really only a small slice of that. Now, the recently completed Ithaca S&R faculty survey conducted at the University of Illinois in 2012 confirms this by noting that the library is, in fact, valued most significantly by our faculty as a provider of access. At Illinois, the faculty take great pride in our collections and are loyal to the library as an entity that provides services that help them to be successful. Now, that recently completed survey notes that 93% of the campus's responding faculty, compared to 80% on the national survey, indicated that they valued the library's role as a buyer. As a buyer of, repository for, or gateway to content, the library ranked above national averages by 13, 16, and 10% in each of those categories. Now, our faculty members value those services, and indeed the local survey indicated that 74% of the Illinois faculty, compared to 50% in the national survey, 56, viewed the facilitation of access as the primary responsibility of the library. We are not, however, just a warehouse of bits or a gateway to bytes. We're an enterprise, and we provide our constituents with access to services. And decisions that may change those services are almost always weighed against the principle of not diminishing what we are currently offering to those constituent populations. The caveat to that, however, is that the services that we offer at our library, and I'm sure many of yours, are not pure implementations at all. In fact, most of them are very carefully manipulated ecosystems in many respects, in which the specific combinations of many parts actually constitute a whole. Now, the process of developing and implementing print management programs, especially for monographic literature, is one in which our local entities are going to really be challenged to try and integrate multiple localized services, including direct and mediated collection development, collection management, ILLDD services, among others, into what is really a pan-institutional operational model. As we know from these programs that have developed around serial literature, there are questions about how bibliographic holdings are going to be represented, how and who is going to get access to various services like ILL, and who's going to be allowed to access the print copies. I mean, very simple issues that we have to resolve. And they are being resolved in a variety of ways. They may be pure instances of, let's see, the slides, oh, there we go. They're being resolved, and they may be resolved in a variety of ways, whether they're pure instances of the stock model, hub models, flow models, distributed models, whatever is, as we see outlined in Lavoie, Malpas, and Shippengrover's publication. But they could be a combination of all those. Now, the most highly developed examples of regional print management for monographic literature are generally located outside of the United States. And they generally center on the collection and preservation of national heritage collections. Now, as Roger noted earlier today, the most well-developed operational models for cooperative print and storage management in the United States, largely focus on journal literature. There may be some exceptions, that are state-based, but largely these are journal-based projects. And they focus on journal literature because it is in many respects high return content for the effort. There's a relatively easy availability of backfile content, And in the end, there is relatively low belief that this is going to damage local services. Now, so the yes, but challenges to cooperatively developing, let alone managing our monographic literature are really almost without bounds. They are lower return projects that hold greater potential to be perceived as diminishments of local services. And then there's the recruiting issue that we all have to deal with at our many campuses. What faculty member is going to want to come to our institution if we don't have the greatest collection of, insert subject area here? We hear that to this day at conferences and on our campuses. Now, these arguments are further enhanced by what we don't know about the collections that we hold and how they are actually being used. That said, there are some things that are fairly well established, either through empirical evidence or professional lore. And if you're a fan of actual data, some of them have been tested and replicated in academic studies. Now, in addition to the data that we saw from Brian and Constance yesterday, here are some bits of information that are actually probably going to inform some of the decision-making that takes place at the University of Illinois. First, libraries have a history of overbuying for local or even regional needs. In recent years, Edward O'Neill and Julia Gammon had a paper, I think it was 2009, talking about, titled Building Collections Cooperatively, an Analysis of Collection Use in the Ohio Link Library Consortium. And they demonstrated that statewide networks of libraries often over-acquired many monographic titles necessary to serve their populations. While multiple holdings benefited users in some cases, usage indicated that significant bodies of material did not require duplicate holdings to serve a network as broad as the Ohio Link membership. Now, Lynn Wiley, Tina Krastowski, and Stephanie Baker applied the same model to the iShare network in Illinois in 2011, receiving results that underscored virtually every point in O'Neill and Gammon's paper. And in the end, really, they point to two things in these studies. There is a middle ground in our acquisitions pattern on a statewide level that is unnecessarily redundant. And that data really appears to be confirmed again by Lavoie and Malpas yesterday in the discussion that we had. And the long tail of our holdings, those items that are infrequently used and not needed for regular on-site reference-type consultation, could effectively meet the needs across the state if resource sharing networks exist to support that. Now, there are immediate costs to this sort of overbuying, and there are longer-term costs that we have to deal with managing these collections that we really should be seeking to avoid on the front end at this point. In many respects, we should know better. And we should be trying to do that because if we don't, we're going to have to deal with this at on the regional print management level. So in the Illinois study, you can see we have the high group of materials, relatively low cost per use, items that were held quite heavily but used reasonably heavily. We have low use materials, and then we have the middle range. And in Illinois, they calculated that over a 5-year period, it was probably $11 million spent on materials that were not necessarily needed that heavily. So there are some very real-world costs to this we should be calculating and thinking about. So the second point that I have that we know about is that resource sharing for scarcely held monographs benefits broad communities beyond our region. Hub model, flow model, some combination of all of these, it really doesn't matter. What matters in the end is, in large part, there are discovery and service layers that are going to facilitate access to these materials. Research by Lenkart, Tepper, Thacker, and Witt, which is currently being peer-reviewed, demonstrates that less commonly taught language materials from UIUC's collection are distributed far and wide throughout the traditional lending networks. Even when we removed the loans to other institutions in Illinois in order to eliminate any bias from the iShare network, there's a little more on that later, institutions in Illinois borrowed nearly 40%, or in the Midwest rather, borrowed nearly 40% of the total number of lictal materials over a 5-year period. The next highest borrower was the southern United States, which received 24%. The northeastern United States borrowed nearly 20%, and the western United States borrowed 17% of the liquid materials. So if you're looking at the history of area studies collecting, these are long-tail collections that were acquired for and in many respects made discoverable for broad populations by design. Now this is 2011 data. If you go into our table for 2012, 7 through 11, you can see the numbers that I was quoting. Now, lastly, if you provide smaller institutions with lightweight options that enable them to benefit from a combination hub flow model, they will take you up on that opportunity. I come from a land grant institution. We have a very serious service mission to the state of Illinois. We value that, we embody that in many respects, and we helped pioneer the iShare network in the late 70s. Frankly, we've had a flow model of fulfillment operational in Illinois for 30 plus years at this point in time. The iShare system provides individuals at 86 member institutions for the Consortium of Academic and Research Libraries in Illinois, or CARLI, with direct access to locate and borrow items from other member libraries. So that's great. But not every one of those member libraries want to or can maintain all of the items that they've acquired over the years on site. So what are they to do if they have to deal with the exact same pressures that many of our bigger state institutions are dealing with regarding space and service needs, et cetera? CARLI and the University of Illinois implemented a voluntary last copy program that allows CARLI members to identify something they think is a last copy in the state, how they define that, not necessarily in the CARLI membership, and basically transfer them to us through the regular lending network in the state of Illinois. It's a very lightweight process with a web form that gives us the OCLC number so we know what's coming. When it's received at Illinois, we verify that it's actually the last copy, and in some cases, they're cataloging variations, it's not. And if it is, we add it to the collection. And accounting for the items that we have discovered were not indeed unique, we've added about 3,500 items in 5 years. Not an overwhelming number of items, but it's a lightweight program with very little overhead that actually targets a very specific body of materials, and it works. It allows our members to get beyond the paralysis of, what if I withdraw the last copy and someone needs it in 10 years issue? And really, in the end, it ensures that the services in the state of Illinois are not being diminished for the members of the CARLI, for that CARLI consortium. In the end, what is going to enable any sort of broad participation in the operations and services of a regional print management program for monographs, or frankly, any type of cooperative model, is that the program is not perceived as diminishing the local services that are offered by the institutions that are participating. So, thank you.
Thank you to all of our panelists. It's been a really rich set of presentations with a lot of territory, covered a lot of information there. We do have about 15 minutes for questions, which can be directed to the panelists. I'm going to step away from the podium for a moment just to make sure our panelists' microphones are on, so you can compose your thoughts and then come to the mic. Oh, they are on. Good. I'm told the microphones are on, so you can take your not composed thoughts to the microphone and pose some questions. I think.
I'll just get the ball rolling. I'm Carla Strebe from Ohio State. Emily, I'm very intrigued, as you know, by this idea of kind of the Netflix model monograph delivery. I'm guessing you perhaps have done some calculation of what you think that might cost on a kind of per item basis. I'm just curious, or other people may have done calculations, along the way of that. What you think that might be.
Actually, I've tried to do some back of envelope costs and realized that we need some expertise from beyond the libraries to do it. So I think there will be costs associated with it. My suspicion from what I have been able to do is that it will be less than current interlibrary lending. However, we might want to consider adding some kind of surcharge to it to generate that redistribution of resources I mentioned to the institutions who generate retention commitments to those undigitized materials. Start to pool those funds there for them to begin to digitize those materials. So we do need to, I think at the end of the day, we actually need to run an experiment to figure out what the appropriate cost parameters are and how widely it needs to be distributed, not just to institutions, but to users as well. So I think what we really need to work on is some core market research to understand what the pricing parameters would need to be for it. But from what I have been able to think about and look at, I think it will be less expensive than interlibrary lending.
Hi, Brian Skibb, University of Michigan. I wanted to follow up on that pricing. I was thinking the same thing. How are we going to afford it, and who's going to pay for it? Are you imagining that libraries will absorb this cost somehow through internal reallocation? And I'm asking that question because an awful lot of what you said rings absolutely true for experience at Michigan. So we deliver things directly to faculty offices. And when we made that service free, when we charged for it, there was, this much demand. Making it free, it is wildly successful. People love it. They love it. It is also driving up our interlibrary loan activity. There are a lot of requests that come in, and actually we don't have the thing, or it's checked out. So interlibrary loan. Then we scan as much as we can. So I'm thinking about barriers to this direct delivery and its cost, which for me I'm thinking most about staffing. When the volume goes up, right? We struggle with that right now. It holds us back from participating more fully in other resource sharing arrangements, because how are we going to, right? So there's cost. Then there's copyright. So we sweat bullets trying to figure out how much we can scan and deliver. But really, so whatever the cost is, and the volume's going to go up, I'm just trying to figure out who's going to pay.
There's so much to unbundle there. I wouldn't know entirely how to start, except to say this is part of what I'm suggesting. We need to work with some experts in logistics re-engineering to understand what the appropriate cost model and distribution, the breadth of user base across which it would need to be distributed to make it sustainable. On the copyright front, one might find very interesting that such a delivery mechanism is very likely to still fall within our general parameters of fair use and their ability to deliver, as long as we're considering working within a set of authenticated users who already have rights and access to our collections. So it could be that we very much could, within rights, deliver more broadly to more institutions. So there's a lot of opportunity there. I guess what I'm suggesting is we do need to I guess another question, aspect around the cost modeling, and it has to do with that initial statistic that I showed, and you've all seen that graph about the declining investment in ARL libraries. It's not just about reshuffling resources. The economies of scale are not just about reshuffling resources across the existing network of research libraries. It is very likely we would need to engage users in distributing those costs as well. So the key thing will be to figure out what is the opportunity cost to our faculty and students of not gaining access to those materials right now. And to what extent is the greater ease of access, something that they would be willing to contribute towards, or that our academic departments and faculty would be willing to subvent. So it's an opportunity for us to really think about recapturing some of the investment from our institutions that has been lost over time in the libraries.
Roger Schoenfeld from Ithaca SNR. This was such a great panel. I feel like some of Arnold's questions, or some of your questions about, what are we trying to achieve here, where you asked us to all raise our hands, and I really felt that resonating through a lot of the presentations, and I think we're hearing I heard different things that you each are trying to accomplish, and I think that's something that I'd like to try to draw out a little further, ask you to draw it out a little further. So I think the contrast that I saw most dramatically was between Emily's vision, which I love, and between for its sort of effectiveness and possibilities, and Tom's your treatment of the Carly last copy policy, which I love for its simplicity and essentially total absence of investment required, and the fact that it seems to actually be working and doing something already. So I wonder, I don't know if there may be other ideas too, but I wonder if you could each just say a couple of pointed words about what you think you are and don't need to be accomplishing in those two scenarios, because I feel like it would be helpful if we could hear that in dialogue a little bit.
I didn't raise my hand, but I was going to. And there were two, actually, that I would have raised my hand on. I know I only get one. My first is increasing access to the print resources in our shared repositories, number one. I think we're seeing I think a component of the decline in use has to do with our existing lending models and logistics models. So in some sense, we may be doing a disservice to our users, so arresting that and recapturing that use and actually extending that use to the long tail the way we've seen it happen in the video rental and music industries, I think would be phenomenal. So increasing use. And the other is optimizing digital and print. So the notion that it may be that users are over time, as we start to address some of those questions that you were asking, Roger, about if we improved the reading experience and the readability of our digital resources, we will start to, and we are able to make those digital resources, expose them and make them accessible. Which, again, I've mentioned, I think, is at least a 20 to 30-year horizon. So that's a good 20 to 30 years where we can optimize our print resources. I think we will eventually see a transition where the preference is for the digital version, and we can begin to discontinue optimizing around print, but I think it's going to be a gradual thing. I think it'd be almost at a title by title basis, so that's not very operational. I think we simply need to focus at this point in time on operationalizing the delivery infrastructure and retention commitment infrastructure.
So I think one of the things that Illinois is very concerned with is providing access to services to our users. We have a deep commitment to that, and of the many, many slices, print management is one of them. Part of that is preserving content. So we're actually succeeding in preserving content that would otherwise potentially be withdrawn and dumpstered in the state. We are also actually providing our faculty members with continued access to materials. And as a land grant institution, we are actually providing a service to the rest of the state of Illinois. And we are enabling the many, many public and private institutions in the state that are members to actually make decisions and get on with it. It's a voluntary program. Some of them are, some of them aren't. But in some cases, we had heard that they were, frankly, stuck on making some decisions. So there's a bit of a parachute for them, and it gives them some options that they didn't have otherwise.
I just want to comment from a director's perspective. It seems to me that what we need to do is start cutting through the irrelevant issues that get staff stuck and get faculty stuck, and start really coping with this, because we can increase, when you go through that short correlation analysis that I did, why are they not correlating? Well, it's pretty clear, because we've got a lot of stuff and very little of it's being used. Doesn't take a genius to figure that out. So you can either fix the numerator or you can fix the denominator. And I think that the big problem we're having right now is we're keeping too much stuff. And we don't want to let go of it. That's what librarians have always wanted to do, and that's what faculty would have us do. But, this is a belt and suspenders sort of problem. How many insurance policies do we need within a state? How many insurance policies do we need across the country? How many insurance policies do we need across the world? And I think if we can start being a little bit, I'm not talking about slash and burn vicious cutting here, but when I talked about it in terms of crap, let's face it, is everything in every storage facility in the United States a gem? No. So let's start finding some ways of identifying, not through circulation, but through content. Let's start finding more creative ways of identifying what's really a gem, what's a potential gem. And look, I've worked with archives, I've worked with special collections, and you never know. Something that came in that you thought was junk turns out to be a gem. But we can't build our future in libraries on the assumption that everything might be that gem, because it just isn't. And a lot of this stuff was commercially published, and it's beaten up and everything else.
So I guess I get the last word on this topic. And I also wanted to raise my hand on two different parts. And one was the issue of access, of course, but there's also the long tail. I think the long tail, growing that, whether it's junk or not. I think we'd like to see good content come in, preferably. But I think those two things are the competing vision. In terms of the priorities of our leadership and how those priorities carry out, ownership is still hugely important to our leadership, and determines a lot of our initiatives, that we really want to own content, not just lease it, and that owning it lets us share it is the intention. But there's also a shift going on, as I'm sure there's a shift going on in a number of places, where there's also a number of products that enhance the ability to access a lot of content for very small institutions that may not have enough content or enough good content. And so, I think there's a divide there, but I was actually really struck by your comments in terms of how people use it, and thinking about our really extensive DDA program and how are people using those, and how do we grow that program in a way that serves a variety of constituents, but also doesn't ignore the need for serious print reading. And how do we think about that consortially, not in one institution, but how do we think about that over the body of our alliance? I think is just a really interesting question. I have no answers, but thank you.
So I think, noting the time, I'd ask you all to join me in thanking our panelists once more.